朋友，大家好，大家晚安，欢迎收看8月28号星期一为您播出的《新台湾加油》，我是许桂雅。今天郭台铭宣布参选总统，正式端上菜了哈，要展开联署。走到这一步呢，起码从517到现在好像是等了3个多月。郭台铭强调，他的参选是为了要促成在野阵营的整合哈。他说在野不整合，便宜赖清德。但是在野整合卡关啊，那郭台铭现在是要以战逼和。不过呢，郭台铭民调排老四想要整合老二的柯文哲，还有老三的侯友宜，很难让侯柯来服气。那么最大的问题是大家都想要当正的，这到底要怎么谈呢？不过比较特殊的是郭台铭他拥有超能力有一句话叫做有钱能使鬼推磨。那么在2024这一场选举当中有用吗？郭台铭参选记者会上，他也宣布黄世修来担任他的发言人，但是黄世修过去有一些失言的争议，而他的智库成员是前卫生署长杨志良。杨志良在新竹帮郭台铭在站台的时候，竟然是语出惊人的说，台湾人会家暴是因为没有办法修理蔡英文。杨志良将整个这样一个暴力行为，居然会把它正当化。郭台铭今天特别缓颊，他说杨志良应该是脱稿演出啦。那郭办表达说，希望叶当来得 cam， 希望他道歉。但没想到下午杨志良呢继续开炮，而且呢他坚持他不会道歉。杨志良自找炮的存在被酸呢，就好像是郭台铭身边的馆长一样。美岛电子报最新民调，3人参选，赖清德是42.5%，柯文哲21.1%，侯友宜是17%垫底。那加上现在还有郭台铭要参选这样的一个细卡都的情况之下呢，赖清德是40.1%。柯文哲16.6%，侯友宜15.6%，郭台铭只有12%，是垫底的。那么吴子嘉他看到的一个情况就是，在野等于整个已经是崩盘了。今天新台湾加油我们的节目独家专访到的是前美国国防部长艾斯培。那么对于侯友宜曾经他讲过这个两岸和平他就要缩短兵役这个部分呢，艾斯培其实他对于兵役台湾的兵役，他曾经公开表示说，缩短兵役将会向中国释放错误的信号。他主张应该是要抗中保台，是要硬起来的。稍后有更多的独家专访的内容。我们先来介绍今天来宾，首先欢迎的是民党立委王定宇。
贵雅，大家好。
接着来欢迎资深媒体人王瑞德。
贵雅好，大家好。
还有民进党台北市议员赵一翔。
贵雅姐，大家好。
好，左手边先来介绍是台湾智库策略长王一川。
大家好。
还有资深媒体人王诗琪。
大家好。
以及国民党台北市议员钟小平。
大家好。
好，郭台铭宣布参选呢，让蓝白的脸都绿了哈。不过今天呢，我们节目要从艾斯培的专访来开始。中国对台海是百般的威胁，那么艾斯培他的主张是，美国应该要战略清晰，才能够阻止中国的恶劣侵略行为。对中国军事威胁，同时也是在美国印太战略的最前线。台湾究竟扮演什么样的角色？今天我们节目当中邀请到美国前国防部长艾斯培来进行对谈，而这也是他此行访台唯一一个政论节目的专访。艾斯培他是美国西点军校毕业，1990年代参与过波湾战争，退伍之后他在华府智库、还有国会贸易单位以及在这个五角大厦累积了非常丰富的经验。2017年担任陆军部长，2019年7月出任国防部长，到2020年的11月，他在担任部长的期间，正好是美中关系正式走向竞争的一个关键时期。让我们来欢迎部长。Let us warmly welcome Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you. First of all, what is the purpose of this visit to Taiwan?
Well, Daphne, the purpose of this visit was to bring a transatlantic delegation. So it's represented by myself, a couple other Americans, and the former president of Lithuania, and a member of the Czech Career Foreign Service. So our purpose was to do additional fact-finding, to get an update on the status of Taiwan, U.S., Taiwan, Europe, and then China-Taiwan relations, and to also share our views with President Tsai and members of her cabinet.
台湾的副总统赖清德，因为不久之前他是以特使的身份出访到巴拉圭，然后有过境美国。在结束他的行程之后呢，隔天中国就宣布在台湾的周边来做军事演习。The military exercise appeared to be an attempt to intimidate Taiwan. How do you perceive such military threats?
Well, I think we have to go back a little bit. You know, the last time I was here in Taiwan was July, I think, of last summer.
Yes.
Just a week or two before Speaker Pelosi's visit. And we know what happened at that point in time. There was an uproar from Beijing. I thought Speaker Pelosi did the absolute right thing in terms of visiting. We, the Americans, should not allow China to dictate where our lawmakers, our elected officials travel. So she did the right thing. But afterwards, of course, we saw a dramatic uptick in tempo from the Chinese military. They conducted a multi-day exercise around the Taiwan Strait. And then from there, a series of things happened. We had Xi Jinping's anointment for a third term. In the United States, we had the balloon incident. We had the ratcheting of tensions. We had President Tsai's visit, which captured a lot of attention as well. And then just recently, Vice President Li's. Look, the Chinese find a reason to complain about one thing or another. As we know, these visits, these transits have occurred in the past. So I was not surprised that they would react. I was surprised. I thought it was more muted than what we might see. So I think it's fair to say that over the past year, tensions have clearly escalated between China and Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait. They've escalated between China and the United States, and I would argue tensions have escalated as well between China and the global community writ large.
The tension in the Taiwan Strait escalated due to Vice President Lai Ching-te's transit to the United States, leading to the deployment of the USS Reagan carrier strike group in the waters of Taiwan's eastern coast. How should we interpret the U.S.'s actions?
Yeah, I think the deployment of the carrier of the Reagan strike group was probably coincidental to what happened. But that said, I've argued that as China has escalated tensions in the Taiwan Strait, as it's broken down the norms of not violating the midline, I think the United States and our partners in the region should also respond. If it means more frequent deployments through the Taiwan Strait to do freedom of navigation operations, that's fine. I think enhanced training and exercises would suit. But I think we have to respond to the Chinese bad behavior because otherwise they will continue to salami slice, as we say, the norms that have been set over the decades between what they should and should not do when it comes to Taiwan, but also other countries as well.
The leaders of the United States, Japan, and South Korea held a summit at Camp David and issued a joint statement reaffirming the importance of Taiwan peace for global stability and prosperity. How do you view this joint statement?
Yeah, first of all, I give the Biden administration credit, and I do that as a Republican for the summit. I thought it was extraordinary. It's great to see Korea and Japan talking and working as closely as they do. Much of that, all that credit goes to President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida. But the fact that President Biden brought them together, they spent a weekend at Camp David or a day at Camp David, and then issued this joint statement, which is very robust. If you read it, it covers everything from the three countries' views on the world, on the region. It talks about ASEAN. It talks about China in particular, which was extraordinary too, because most experts didn't think that Korea would speak out like this in a joint statement about China. And then, of course, there is a paragraph about Taiwan and the importance of maintaining peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. So I think it was all very significant. It's good to see the three countries coming together. And importantly, through this summit, they aim to establish some institutional practices where there would be joint military training, exercises between the three of them, commitments to meetings between their defense ministers and ministers of foreign affairs. So it's really a comprehensive approach, and I'm glad to see it emerge because I think as tensions escalate in the Taiwan Strait, and again, around the periphery of China, it's important that the United States act with its partners and allies because we are all committed to ensuring peace and stability in an open Indo-Pacific.
Setting aside historical grievances, Japan, South Korea, and United States are cooperating to create an Asian NATO. What is the emergency of this at the moment?
Well, of course, I don't think they explicitly said they're trying to create an Asian NATO. For some reason, people are opposed to that. I think it makes sense to knit together a multilateral framework as compared to or in addition to the bilateral security agreements that the United States has with the Philippines, Japan, and Korea. But I think it would be important to try and establish such a security framework and an economic one as well, because I think what it does, it knits together the democracies of the Indo-Pacific region, particularly Northeast Asia, to really push back on a very aggressive Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping. And we've seen over the last few years the wolf warrior diplomacy emerge. We see Chinese bad behavior continue, not just in the Taiwan Strait, but just a week or two ago, we had the actions of the Chinese Coast Guard against the Philippines and the water cannon incident. Now we learn that they may be militarizing another shoal claimed by the Vietnamese. So the Chinese bad behavior just does not seem to be relenting. So I think we need to gird ourselves. The democracies of the world need to gird themselves against this bad behavior. I've said in other fora that, look, we're dealing now with a hot war in Europe against one autocrat, and we seem to be slipping into a new Cold War against another called China.
日本的已故前首相安倍晋三，他是讲说，台湾有事就等于美日同盟有事。那包括南韩总统尹锡悦，他也讲说，台湾问题是全球的问题。In the event of the crisis in Taiwan Strait, what approach do you believe that the U.S., Japan, and South Korea should take? Would they consider joint defense?
Well, first of all, I think these are very significant statements by the Japanese leader and by the Korean leader. I think Prime Minister Kishida has been very forward-leaning. Not only did he make that statement about conflict with Taiwan, its impact on Japan, but keep in mind, he's also doubled Japan's defense budget, and he has moved forward with reinterpreting their constitution to allow for an offensive capability to be built into the self-defense forces. And President Yoon, just the same, I think, recognizes it. Now, from the United States perspective, I think part of the rationale here is Japan probably hosts more American service members than any other country in the world. And of course, we have 29,000 Americans on the Korean Peninsula as well, defending against the North Koreans. Look, it's hard to predict how a Taiwan Strait conflict may emerge. Would the Chinese be so bold to attack American forces or attack American forces on Japan or Korea? We don't know. But certainly if they would do that, it would involve those two countries. I think if it is just isolated to the United States, we would probably need to draw from forces in Japan. So it's hard to predict how that would play out. But it is important that the leaders of these three countries recognize that. I'm confident that the defense ministers do as well. I know in my tenure we had these conversations about if conflict would emerge. So it's important that everybody is talking and discussing these matters and preparing themselves mentally for what might happen. We've heard what Xi Jinping has said about the year 2027 and the need for the PLA to be prepared. So I think we're all looking ahead and trying to anticipate and be prepared for the worst.
President Biden has repeatedly expressed that if China uses force against Taiwan, the U.S. will militarily intervene. How do you view this as a consensus in U.S. politics?
Yeah, so I guess the statements by President Biden, I think he was probably more ambiguous in that. He talked about coming to Taiwan's defense. Now, he said it 4 times, and on each occasion the White House walked it back, which makes no sense to me. But let me say this much. I think given the state of affairs in the Taiwan Strait, I think with the increasing actions and belligerence by Beijing, driven by Xi Jinping, I've called for more strategic clarity in the U.S. position rather than ambiguity, because my view is I think Beijing needs to clearly know where the United States would fall on this issue if China, unprovoked, attacks Taiwan. And so I've applauded President Biden for this statement. I think it makes sense.
部长他其实态度非常清楚，就是他要战略清晰。可是战略清晰跟战略模糊之间呢，其实在美国感觉上，他们其实有非常多不一样的声音。那部长，我们了解他是一个对中比较是鹰派的哈。我想请问的是，那有一些反对的声音，究竟要如何抗衡？
Well, I think the position with regard to strategic ambiguity or clarity in this case is going to be determined by the occupant of the White House. And in this matter, President Biden has spoken out clearly as far as I'm concerned, and I think his instincts are right on that matter. My view has been that when you're dealing with autocrats, whether they reside in Moscow or Beijing, you have to be very clear about the lines you'll draw, the stances you'll take, the resolve that you will show. And in some ways, I don't think we deterred enough Vladimir Putin and didn't cite clearly enough our opposition to what he was proposing to do 18 months ago as Russian forces were poised across the Ukrainian border. And so I think with more clarity and more resolve, we might have been able to prevent that from happening. That's why I think it's more important, if not more urgent now, that we speak with one voice and clearly about opposition to Chinese belligerence against Taiwan. And look, I know that the Chinese raise this issue all the time, but if you go all the way back to 1972, you look through all the communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, it says a couple things very clearly. One is we expect that differences between on the matter of Taiwan to be resolved peacefully. China committed to doing so. They committed to a peaceful resolution of these matters, and the United States also expressed, certainly through the Taiwan Relations Act, that we would consider any use of force to resolve this matter of grave concern. So in many ways, the United States' position has not changed, but the Chinese position has changed over the years, and I would argue has accelerated in terms of its behavior here the last 7, 8, I guess 10 years now since Xi Jinping came to power.
我再追问一个问题哦，因为部长你刚刚提到的是说，要战略清晰，要让对手比较清晰的知道说，态度是什么。但是因为在俄乌战争当中，我们看到乌克兰，其实当时拜登总统他在讲说，美国不会出兵，那是不是也导致说俄罗斯有某种程度，他认为反正你不会出兵，所以他们有了这样子就进一步做入侵的行为。
Look, I think overall the Biden administration has done a good job with regard to support for Ukraine. I think they brought the allies together. They've kept NATO unified, but they've been slow in weapons deliveries. They've been slow in providing arms and material. By the way, they've been slow in the Asia Pacific as well with regard to Taiwan, and we can talk about that if you want. But take that model as you proposed and overlay it on this situation. Again, I think the strategic clarity needs to be consistent with the Taiwan Relations Act, that we will continue to provide arms sales, services, those things. And as the Taiwan Relations Act said, that any attempt to change the status quo by force, to include coercion or embargo, would be considered a grave concern, which is diplomatic speak for U.S. forces. We would consider the military option. So I think putting more clarity into that, extending that now because of China's behavior, actually deters Beijing from making such a move. Now, I also said last year when I was in Taiwan, I've exchanged, shared these views with President Tsai, with members of her cabinet. I think there are a lot of things Taiwan needs to do as well. I think the decision to expand conscription from 4 months to 1 year was a great decision, a tough decision, but the right decision. But I also think you need to expand the defense budget. We need to really emphasize, vastly improve training for active duty forces, for the reserve, for the territorial elements, the stockpiling of supplies and energy and whatnot. Things like that, adopting an asymmetric approach to defending Taiwan and then procuring the arms and material to do that are all important things that need to happen. Because I think Xi Jinping looking across the Taiwan Strait, seeing 23 million Taiwanese who are willing to fight and die for their democracy, for their sovereignty, sends the strongest signal of all to Beijing. And importantly, sends a strong signal to the United States and its allies that Taiwan is going to fight. And if Taiwan fights, I think we will fight, just like we see in Ukraine. And I think those are all important messages to send to not just Beijing, but also to other democracies around the world. I'm pleased to see that moving along, but I think we all, Taiwan, the United States, and others, need to have a greater sense of urgency based on what Xi Jinping keeps saying about 2027.
好，其实因为乌克兰战争俄乌战争让我们非常的警醒，尤其是世界大家感受到，就是对我们要先有这个捍卫国家的信心，然后也看到，你有捍卫国家的信心之后，才会延续性的，可能我们的盟友美国、日本、韩国甚至包括菲律宾，搞不好也会投入这一场仗哈。这是部长刚刚给我们的一个提示跟警语哦。那我接着要请教的是How do you believe that the greatest threat to democracy comes not from Russia, but from Asia? What is your perspective on China?
Clearly, Russia is a threat to Europe, given its nuclear capabilities globally. But we found in Ukraine that Russia is not a first-rate military power, at least when it comes to its ground army. At best, it's the second best military in Ukraine. I think we've seen the weaknesses of the Russian system. But I think the important difference here, both in the conflict today with Russia, as it was during the Cold War, Russia is a one-dimensional threat. It has a military. China is a full-spectrum threat. China has the largest military in the world. China has the second largest economy in the world. China has a very modern technological sector. China has a lot of diplomatic heft around the world. So when I look at China compared to Russia, I see a China that is a full spectrum threat, that is using its market power around the world to influence and coerce people. I saw a statistic the other day that 120 countries register China as their top trading partner. So China is able to use that muscle to influence and shape other countries' decisions. I mean, right now, as I understand it, they've embargoed mangoes from Taiwan. They've embargoed the Japanese. A few years ago, when the United States put a weapons system into Korea, they embargoed certain Korean products and tourism in Korea. They've done it to the Australians. This is the Chinese bad behavior that we're trying to oppose. This is why the democracies of the world, led by the United States, have said, look, we want to preserve international rules and norms. There are behaviors that we fought for in World War II that were developed after that conflict that for 70, 75 years now have sustained economic prosperity and security around the world. In fact, I would argue it's that system that enabled China, when it entered the WTO, to lift 800 million Chinese out of poverty. And now they want to turn that system on itself against us to impose their view on the world, their values, which means a surveillance state where you don't have rights and freedoms, where you don't have liberties, when you don't have a voice in your own government. All those things that we cherish in the United States that Taiwan has built up as a very robust democracy over the past few decades, they want to take those things away. Just ask the people of Hong Kong. We've seen what China has done there.
我们现在其实比较担心，尤其是在台海之间，大家担心的是军事方面的威胁。尤其我们看到他们在军事能力方面的提升，哈，比方像是什么？我们知道说，习近平希望在中国2049这个年份是怎么出来的？主要是因为中国建国100周年，他们希望说解放军的整个军力要提升到什么程度？要世界一流，也就是说要跟美国来做匹敌哦。所以呢，其实部长您曾经提过一个计划是2045的战略计划哈，包括未来的海军战力的结构，要确保就是美国海军未来几十年还能够处于一个领先的地位。所以我想请教的是哦，可不可以跟我们说明一下你的2045的战略计划是一个什么样的构想？
Sure. Look, I think you've laid out some important timelines. Xi Jinping did say that by 2035, they wanted to have a modern military, and by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the PRC, they wanted to overtake the United States with regard to capability. And many of us believe, and I think it's been said, that they want to dominate the Indo-Pacific by then, push us out. And we've seen comments like that from their defense minister and others. So my aim was to make sure that we could build a Navy, but also reform our entire military to make sure we were more capable before those timelines. And so the Navy of 2045 that I proposed in the fall of 2020 said that we need to have a larger fleet, over 500 vessels, manned and unmanned, but in terms of manned surface vessels, more distributed, smaller, with greater lethality. We needed more submarines because submarines are the one capability that clearly dominates around the world, would have incredible capabilities here as well. And then we needed to do a number of other things. But look, it's the fight, if you will, here in this region. It's not just a naval fight. It's Air Force, it's Army, it's Space Force, it's cyber. All those things we need to enhance and improve. You know, we talk about China having the largest military in the world. That's true. But they also have space and cyber capabilities. And I argued as Secretary of Defense that the first shots of any war with Taiwan or against Taiwan would begin in space and cyberspace, or with the United States for that matter. In fact, yesterday we spent some time with INSDR here in Taipei and had a long discussion about this. And I think the views as well as people there is that any Chinese attack would begin with some type of capabilities to use cyber against us, against Taiwan, and to blind our satellites. So we need to improve in all those domains of warfare. And again, while I think we have the greatest military in the world and the best Navy, we need to keep improving. We need to keep modernizing. We need to keep adopting advanced technologies such as AI and directed energy and all those things. And we need to share them as much as we can with Taiwan and other allies and partners as well.
The U.S. has introduced over 30 Taiwan-related bills in the first half of this year. What is your observation?
That's all? I thought there were more than that introduced. Look, I think it shows great bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for Taiwan. When I worked on Capitol Hill in the early 2000s, late 1990s, and I write about this in my book, my memoir, which I think is out in Taiwan now, I describe it a time where Taiwan had a very robust presence in Washington, D.C., but over time I saw the Chinese had kind of developed their own, and there was a period in time there where many folks bought into the Chinese liberalization theory that has now been disproven. And we saw a change in behavior, if you will. And so now fast forward 20-some years on Capitol Hill, as I said earlier, if there's one thing that unifies Republicans and Democrats, it's opposition to China and support for Taiwan, which I think is very important. It sends all the right messages. That this issue unifies people more than it does Ukraine, in fact. So I think it's important that we show this support to Taiwan in opposition to China.
因为我们的国务卿布林肯他其实曾经有提到过一个事情，是说2027年可能会有这个攻台的时间表。那当然也会造成台湾人心里面会蛮担心的。但是有一个部分是想要请教说，我们知道说，当感觉上时间越来越逼近的时候，然后又看到美国方面总统有一个拨款权，就是可以无偿的提供军援的这一个部分，你觉得这一个构想的来源是什么？
So I think with regard to the remarks about China and 2027, I've seen a different iteration of that, and something that is actually more alarming. It was Xi Jinping told the PLA, People's Liberation Army, be prepared by 2027. So this is coming from the General Secretary of the Communist Party saying, be ready by 2027. And why is that? We can only speculate. We do know that his term is up. His third term is up in 2028. We do know that he wants to leave his mark on Chinese history, that he wants to be in the pantheon of other great PRC leaders like Mao. And he's saying that the key to national rejuvenation is the restoration of the Chinese empire, which includes Taiwan. And so one can only conclude that as he reaches his third term, and he's a 70-year-old man, that maybe that he sees Taiwan slipping away, and he may try to grab Taiwan before his third term is up, or maybe as a prelude to his fourth term. And we could talk about what all that means now, given the state of the Chinese economy and where that's heading. But needless to say, I think that has caught everybody's attention in Washington, certainly in the military. I spent a day at Indo-PACOM before I arrived here, speaking to the commanders there, and we're all focused on that date, if not sooner, right? Because we never know when China's going to do something. It's Xi Jinping's call. And so I think the important thing is to prepare for that moment to happen at any time. So, look, I'm glad to see that from Washington's perspective, the president got authority from Congress to do what was called a presidential drawdown authority. The first tranche was made a couple weeks ago, I think $345 million. That's very important. That's another means to get arms and ammunition and material to Taiwan. But there's also $20 billion or so in foreign sales that are held up. And I've argued back in Washington that we should reprioritize the arms deliveries and accelerate them. They don't need to go to some of the other countries, either in Europe or the Middle East. They should be prioritized here because I think it would have a far greater deterrent value. And then, of course, the view from the American side is we need to enhance our training, and Taiwan needs to enhance its training as well to improve the skills and and all that with regard to the Taiwanese military, especially the Army. And so I think doing all those things really help improve the deterrent capability of Taiwan and cause Xi Jinping to think twice about making a move in the year 2027.
我们其实听到部长这一些说法我们非常谢谢他支持台湾和平、台海的和平。那最后，既然他来到台湾访问有一些要请教的是 regarding your impression of Taiwan, how many times have you visited Taiwan?
Well, I visited here several times. My first experience was probably in the early 2000s there. I think President Tsai is not the first Taiwanese leader that I met. I've also traveled to China several times, and I think Xi Jinping is the only Chinese leader I haven't met since that period. So I've tried to take a broad perspective, visiting not just Taiwan, but China, Korea, Japan, and other places to make sure I could really understand the issue. I've described the 21st century as China being the greatest challenge, if not threat, for the United States and democracies around the world. And we're now in the thick of that period, it seems. So it's important that we have more interaction, more transparency, more opportunities like this week to come visit Taiwan and to have a good exchange of views.
我们不能免俗的哈，最后要请教部长，你来台湾的经验这么多次哈，那除了说公务方面之外哈，其他还有一些其他的这个想要跟你分享的是，the cuisine in Taiwan is quite distinct from that in the U.S. Are there any particular Taiwanese dishes that you enjoy?
Oh my goodness, the toughest question of the night. You know, we have sampled and ate so many different dishes over the past 5 days. It's hard to pick one, but I will say that we had dinner the other night with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joseph Wu, and one of the dishes was a fried rice with some tasty beef, and it was extraordinary. So I hope to bring my wife back at some point and share some of that cuisine. And yesterday we had the chance to go out and see some of the cultural sites and historic sites. So it's just wonderful to be here and to experience, and to not just have the chance to interact with President Tsai, her cabinet, and some of the ministries, but to go out among the Taiwanese people, to visit your historical sites, to taste your food, to get a feel for what the city is like. And, you know, I think on Tuesday we went down and visited the naval base on the western coast, and it was just fabulous to ride the bullet train and to see the countryside, to see the cities, and then to get there and just get a different feel for the country. So every time I come, I learn something, I see something, and I better appreciate this robust democracy that you have going on here. That's only, in many ways, a few decades old, right? Since democracy really came to pass here in Taiwan. So it's exciting to see and experience, and I like to see the change every time I come.
部长，不晓得你有没有注意到我们今天的这个布置？你有没有注意到我们这个布置？让我为您介绍一下，我们这个布置呢，其实特别挑的就是说，国旗的颜色。那这是美国的国旗，这是中华民国的国旗。你有没有感受到我们的巧思？
Well, it's important. It's wonderful to see these colors, and you know, for the United States, and some would say that the red in our flag represents the blood we are willing to spill to defend our democracy, because we value democracy so much. We value our liberties, our freedoms, all those rights that are guaranteed in our Constitution. And I think the Taiwanese people do too. And I think it's that type of commitment and the understanding that democracy is fragile, that it's a special thing that we share. Not really many countries around the world have liberties and freedoms, not many peoples. And I've had the privilege to travel around the world. And these are special gifts that our forefathers and others have given us. So it's important that we commit ourselves to defending them and being willing to sacrifice for our country and for our fellow man.
哇，部长真的是满满的国防魂啊！包括看着我们这一盆花，他也有很多这个国防方面的心机要跟我们表达。今天我们非常谢谢部长接受我们的专访啊，也祝您此行可以圆满顺利。
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you, and it's a great interview. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we'll have to do it again next time.
各位都在批评黄世修，都在批评杨志良。昨天到今天，网络第一名全部是郭台铭跟杨志良，你知道吗？